Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Don't forget to check out my locals, which is in the low bar, to support the channel and follow for more updates. And for those that already are supporting, thank you for without your support, we couldn't be doing this. So today's discussion is federal Europe. So the idea of a European Union army, which has been in the works for at least a decade now, has sort of floundered for a long time. With the end of the Cold War, Germany sort of entered into this we might call pacifist mode under social democrats and Green Party types, where Germany wasn't really even meeting its NATO minimum 5% of GDP expenditures. I think at its lowest point, it spent like 1.3% of GDP on the defense. Scholz is slated to about double it. That's still far short of the NATO requirement. During that time, France has actually become probably the most well-equipped and well-trained European army over the last, say, 10 years. With Brexit and the Eurosceptic movement sort of crumbling, with England leaving the European Union, leaving places like Poland and Hungary without a real support, a lot of the impediments to a more integrated, consolidated Europe seem to have gone away. Because obviously France and Germany are going to far outweigh the influence of, say, Poland or Hungary or any Eastern European country. And we also see that with the Russian-Ukrainian war, Olaf Scholz has ran through a 100 billion euro defense bill, which more than doubles Germany's defense budget, writing it into the constitution so that you can't actually get rid of it. So it seems like, Germany's doing a catch-up with regards of military preparedness for any future conflict with Russia. And we also see that Olaf Scholz and Macron are talking again, renewed talks about a European defense force. France and Germany are also having basically a new sort of model for armored vehicles, tanks, APCs, infantry fighting vehicles, all using the same models, a kind of precondition for a European army where you're all using the same combat platforms. Now, if we look at the broader take of, say, someone like George Friedman in his 100 years into the future, and then Peter Zion, they don't seem to be they seem to be a little more bearish on the idea of a federal Europe. But I just don't really buy their reasoning. So the reasoning of George Friedman is I think pretty weak. He says that, well, Germany's, I guess, basically just used up. And he says that America is going to prop up Poland in order to create a power base to contain Russia, such that that'll just outweigh anything Germany can do. Well, I mean, there's a lot of problems with that. The United States just can't, wave a magic wand and create regional powers. We tried that in South Vietnam. We tried that with the ANA in Afghanistan. It doesn't work. So I think Poland would just be a third failure if we tried to do that. Furthermore, it's far more natural for the United States to work with Germany. I mean, after all, it was during the Cold War that the French, British, and American parts of occupied Germany were reconstituted into West Germany in 1955 in order to create a meaningful military presence for NATO to fight the Soviets. Because we know the French weren't going to stop the Soviets, and we know the Italians weren't going to stop the Soviets. So we already have a precedent of the United States working with the regional German power to contain Russian expansion. So I think it's far more likely, contra Friedman, that the United States would just work with Germany and then help build them up to contain any Russian threat. This is also in light of the fact that Donald Trump was signaling that the United States was, Donald Trump was no longer interested in supporting the U.S. security obligations to Europe. But I think more to the point, the United States is beginning to lack the economic capabilities to shoulder most of that burden. It's going to have to be offloaded. This is something that, for example, Pat Buchanan in his 1999 work, A Republic, Not an Empire, was discussing. Obviously, he was a bit ahead of his time in that regard. The United States still wanted to impose the military umbrella, bearing most of the cost itself, over Europe. I think the reason why we didn't see Pat Buchanan's concerns come to the forefront sooner was because Russia was so weak during that time, and the United States and Europe could pretend that this was good enough. Now, Peter Zion makes some, I think, pretty weak arguments as well. He says that, well, Germany has an aging population. Okay, so does all of Europe. So does Russia. In fact, Russia's a lot worse off than Germany. So between the two of them, I don't really see that Germany's in an unfavorable position in an absolute sense against some ideal perfect opponent. But any actual opponent that it's going to face over the next century, I think Germany's still in a much better position vis-a-vis, say, Russia, vis-a-vis, say, Turkey, and, contra Friedman vis-a-vis Poland. We also see that Zion makes a rather bizarre claim that, well, England might want to stop Germany from consolidating Eastern Europe. Well, that didn't work out too well in 1939. I don't think they're going to do that again. How is England going to stop Germany from consolidating Eastern Europe? It can't. The only nation that could is Russia, but Russia's worse off in all the relevant factors of demography, economics, and everything else. So I think that we have, especially in light of the Russian threat, which the Western media has, I think, exaggerated, we do see, I think, a convergence point with the absence of England and the UK from the European Union and the renewed threat from Russia, that a European federation with a European army is a real possibility now. What do you think, Keith?
There's a lot going on here. Way back in the era of the war on terrorism, when the neocons, the Project for a New American Century, and groups like that were putting together this fantasy of a new American century where there was going to be this global American imperium, this kind of Pax Americana that sort of reigns perpetually, for the name of benevolent hegemony and keeps the peace and prevents terrorism and spreads democracy and capitalism throughout the entire world. I knew at the time that was going to be a failure, and it has. 20 years later, the verdict is in, and it's been a mess. And I suspected that the result of that would be the United States would start to recede in terms of influence, in part through exhaustion, in part through loss of hegemony, loss of legitimacy, and things like that. And in the process, I thought that the Asian powers would start to rise, like Russia and China, which they have. And I also suspected that international institutions like NATO and the United Nations would become more important, which they have. And I also suspected that Europe would become more assertive. And now we're seeing that as well, because I think that the goal among the European elites is that they ultimately do want to have a type of United States of Europe. I think they look across the Atlantic and see that the United States is in decline in terms of its international influence. And they're hoping that they can step in and become the new United States. I think they have the plan of developing the European Union and associated institutions into a kind of United States of Europe. And I mean, even if they don't consolidate all of that into one country, the federation itself, the European Union Federation, will become essentially the equivalent of what the United States is now. That is a continental imperium that has its own military forces and that is able to project power beyond, way beyond its own geographical sphere of influence. And it seems that the war in Ukraine has really accelerated that process because, as Todd was pointing out, all of a sudden we see the Germans becoming rather hawkish in ways they haven't for quite some time. And I think it's clear that a United States of Europe would be dominated by Germany. Germany has the strongest economy of any of those countries. Germany is also geographically located in a position that would be ideal to assume the leadership of the federal Europe or United States of Europe or whatever you would want to call it. And I think that this is another issue that we haven't discussed, but I suspect that the leadership of a lot of the continental European countries believe that they are better equipped to ultimately handle relations with the Russians than the Atlantic powers. Because one thing we have to consider is that one reason why the Russians are so fervent in their insistence that the Eastern European countries be kept out of NATO is because they see NATO as the arm of the Atlantic powers, which it is. Traditionally, that's what NATO was. After World War II, the Western Europe was essentially just a collection of protectorates under the U.S. umbrella. That's all NATO was in that time. Now NATO has been expanded to this continental military federation. It's been expanded into Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and so forth. And obviously, the Russians see that as a security threat. But I think the Germans at this point and other dominant countries in the European Union look at it like now they are in a position where they can essentially take control of NATO if they need to or want to. And they can chart their own course in terms of what their relationship with countries like Russia or China, some of these other major Asian powers, is going to be. And I think they view themselves as having somewhat different interests than the Americans. As far as Eastern Europe, those countries are always going to be dependents of Western Europe, whether Western Europe is dominated by NATO under America's leadership or Atlanticism or Germany or France or whomever. Poland and Romania and the Baltic states are not going to emerge as dominant powers in Central Europe or Eastern Europe. They're always going to be dependent on the further Western countries if their goal is to be able to effectively resist the influence of Russia, which is clearly their goal. I mean, the overwhelming majority of people I've ever known from any of those countries are very hawkish when it comes to their anti-Russian sentiments. In fact, right now, NATO is having to keep Poland and some of these other countries on a short leash to keep them from getting too involved in the war in Ukraine. And I think that those countries are always going to be pro-Western before they have anything to do with Russia. I mean, unless they have a coup by a communist or something like that, or Eurasianist. And in fact, I could even see the EU being expanded to include other countries in the region. For example, Moldova has petitioned to join the EU. Georgia has petitioned to join the EU. And once a country is in the EU, they're actually part of the defensive compact between the EU countries. So I think you're going to see more countries from those regions that dislike the Russians trying to get into the EU. That would in turn strengthen the position of the EU, where they would want to have their own defensive confederation. I think ultimately they're going to try to blend the EU and NATO into each other with the goal of kind of pushing the Atlantic powers to the side, say, well, you just stay over there in the Atlantic. But it's going to be interesting to see how, to the degree to which that emerges, and then how they go about actually handling their relationship with the Russians. Historically, the Germans and the Russians have not exactly had a good relationship. So we'll see how that works.
Right. Swithun Dobson.
It's clear that the EU do want an army at some point. This goes back at least to the Nice Treaty of 2001, where they wanted to have a rapid reaction force, which all the pro-EU types in England was like, oh no, this is a European army. This is just some sort of special reserve force of some description. But it is clear that that's where they want to go, and they can now develop it more, as you said, without British involvement in the EU dragging the heels. Because if you were sort of like a Eurosceptic type in any other country apart from Britain, then having Britain in the EU was kind of quite handy, because it did prevent the extent of integration that, say, the French and the Germans would typically be in favor of. Also, the notion of sort of having an entirely federal Europe goes back to the inception of the EU to begin with. I mean, even the Treaty of Rome in 1957, ever closer union. The whole point was effectively to begin with to create a federal Europe of types. Various influences, Alterio Spinelli, amongst others. You wanted to create this federated European body. Obviously, an army would help with that. Also, it would signal as well, because this is what a lot of pro-Euro types are saying after the financial crisis in 2009, was that, well, one way they could have mitigated this problem if they were able to have more highly coordinated fiscal policy. And that would have prevented some of the overborrowing by the Club Med, the Italians, the Spanish, the Greeks, the Portuguese, and also in the post-crash part, it would have allowed more central EU funds to funnel money to Greece and other places in a similar way that the federal United States government can. If you've got, say, a recession in Mississippi, for instance, you can send money there, and you've got this all highly coordinated system. So by getting the army and trying to reconstitute this within the EU under German leadership will be a way of advancing the European project to its ultimate fulfillment. With respect to the potential of Germany as a military power, yeah, of course, the demographics aren't great in Germany. As Todd, you said, in Russia, they're bad as well. I mean, I was just having a look at the birth rates. The birth rates in Germany are actually higher than they are in Russia. Russia's birth rate is at 1.504, and Germany's at 1.54. Now, granted, most of those in Germany probably aren't actually German. But if you're going to go in raw manpower, that was in 2019. They've got people to work with. When it comes to the potential military capability of Germany, they are currently the second biggest at present, according to 2021, the second biggest military spender in Europe, slightly ahead of France, but crucially a lower proportion of GDP. The UK is the biggest military spender with around 2.7. Nobody gets close to the 5% value. Actually, Russia spends 4.3%. In comparison, so they're very much more spending militarily. So Germany does have a lot that they can go with. So I mean, if they were to double their military spending, they would be able to get. They would be the world's third largest military spender, behind the US and China, with like approximately $100 billion in spending. So they could be a serious player. The one thing, of course, that Germany doesn't have is nukes, which of course France has. Now, obviously, the French and Germans play along, then that might be quite handy, because what has been noted by various analysts in the past is actually the most federalist part of the EU was actually France, more so than Germany. France, in a way, saw the European Union as a way that they could dominate the Germans. Because, again, the French and the Germans historically haven't really got on very well. So that's not entirely surprising. Philip Baggis argues that actually it was the French who were behind the euro. It was a way that they said, okay, yeah, you can reunify Germany without any complaints, because that only comes with the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, which was signed in 1992. The formalization of trying to get sort of the euro on board from there. Baggis's argument is that the French were fed up of the Germans having a relatively stronger currency than they did, and they couldn't import cheaply because the French kept debasing their currency constantly. So as a way of trying to hide that, they'll go into the euro. So I think Germany would have potentially somewhat large capabilities of being able to have some influence in the East. And obviously they're closer to the East than, say, Britain is. And they could be a potential major player. And with, say, the UK out of the EU, you could get the EU as a sort of separate European bloc, further distance from the Americans. That would probably accelerate if you ever get another Republican president. The finances in the US aren't what they were. It'd be interesting to see whether or not the Germans get annoyed and try and kick the American bases out of Germany. That would be a particularly interesting sign if they were particularly serious about going it alone. But I don't really see that happening any particularly soon. But of course, there's a possibility. So those would be my sort of general assessments of Germany's potentials in military power.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, I think that we're beginning to witness the repercussions of a slowly retracting Pax Americana. As we've discussed in the recent past, we're slowly seeing the return of a multipolar world in which is more similar to the era that preceded World War I, where regional power is the more dominant mode of power expression as opposed to an international power like the United States. One interesting point that I believe deserves some attention with this ostensibly emerging German military or an EU army or something like that is that in November of 2017, there was a leaked German defense policy paper called the Strategic Perspective 2040. It basically details how Germany would react politically and militarily to the collapse of the European Union and a resurgent Russia. They're basically sort of signaling that is a more than a possibility by 2040, and that how Germany would or should react to something like that. And taking a broader step back and just looking at this sort of a macro historical perspective, is that Germany is still sort of in this spiritual bog of demoralization from World War II. They've basically educated, and if you could even say slightly brainwashed their populations, that they're basically the moral equivalent of the orcs from The Lord of the Rings, just due to the atrocities of World War II. Germany, in all of its historical projects and goals, they've always needed a unifying system of belief, whether that's Protestantism or back in the ancient days of when the Germanic barbarians finally overtook Rome, or they need a unifying system. They've basically rejected everything from fascism to communism, Christianity, and they're basically just this pacified philosophical tabula rasa, and they're also demoralized. So they're too pensive and too just historically battered to attempt to become another significant world power. So Germany just needs something. It needs something to unify around. It needs something to rally around again, and whether or not that's some type of some form of Christianity or something like that. Either way, Germany is just sort of in this demoralized state. But I think it's slowly starting to realize that it needs to be a strong economy, which it already is, but it also needs to maintain a strong military in order to sort of keep the European house in order, if you can refer to it as that. So I think that this increase in defense spending is sort of a slow move in that direction. With a quick comment on sort of the possibilities of an EU army, it is interesting that the company called Rheinmetall, which has been around, I believe, since World War I, if not a bit longer than that, they're creating various universal combat platforms that can be remotely controlled or manned by crews. These are just very modernized, very kitted out vehicles that multiple nations that are being sold to multiple nations like France and even non-EU countries like Switzerland and various German allies. Various Rheinmetall products are being sold to Poland and some of the Baltic states. So they are creating these universal combat platforms that can be shared across multiple nations. Germany has learned a lot logistically from World War II in the sense that it's better to have simpler designed vehicles and various combat platforms and weapons rather than having this vast variety of weapons that are difficult to work on, that are over-engineered. For example, the Tiger tank in World War II, although it had extremely high, I guess you could just say high kill ratios, it was a bit over-engineered. They're very expensive. They're heavy. They have various mechanical issues, and it was difficult to swap out engines. Whereas, nowadays, fast forward to the 2020s, these newer vehicles from Rheinmetall are the weapon systems, the engines, the drivetrains. These are all highly swappable and very quickly. So they've learned a lot logistically from World War II, and so they're applying that to a lot of these newer combat platforms. Now, the last thing I'll say too is that Germany politically has signaled basically since the 1970s that it wants countries like the Baltic states and Poland and the Czech Republic and Austria as basically a zone of influence and a buffer zone between the threat of the East. So they and this there's a lot of Germanic economic and cultural influence in those countries, and so in the same way that the United States has influenced places in Europe, Germany is trying to influence Eastern Europe to be sort of its favorable cultural sort of influencer and natural ally, as opposed to the Russians. They're trying to sell the idea that the Russians, is this sort of aggressor, and the Germans are this, a beacon of sort of, enlightenment and I don't know. I guess you could say just moral righteousness, if you want to call it that. But I think I'll leave my initial comments at that.
All right. Well, yeah, as far as the economy goes, as of 2021, Germany is the largest economy in Europe, roughly 3 times that of Russia. And so the German and French economies together would just dwarf Russia. So as far as what its ability to produce. And what I think is important here when it comes to looking at geopolitical trends and how these trends manifest themselves. This is something that Keith, you and I have talked about before in other contexts. The Europe is Germany and Germany is Europe. Since Charlemagne in 800, Germany has been the heart of Europe. And until things radically change in Europe in a way that's comparable to, say, the Roman Empire converting to Christianity or something, we're not going to see that change. That's just how Europe is. And in a space where the United States is fleeing and leaving a quote-unquote security vacuum, only Germany can shoulder that burden, and maybe France. And so we also see the historical entity called the Holy Roman Empire. And it's not entirely disanalogous to say that a federal Europe today would itself be a continuation of, at least in thought and spirit, of the HRE. In fact, I think when the European Union was founded, they had a thing called the Charlemagne Award, because they were intentionally trying to reconstitute something like the federal system that we saw in the Holy Roman Empire. Obviously more modern, more secular, not rooted in the Catholic Church or anything like that. But nonetheless, that seems to be the norm. And we also see that there are a lot of geopolitical analysis fail to understand national characteristics. Right. Niall Ferguson, for example, speculates that if the Kaiser had won World War I, there would have been a German-European Union then under what was called Mitteleuropa, Middle Europe. And he says, okay, that's likely what the Germans would have done had they been successful in the First World War, which doesn't really sound all that different from what's going on now. And then, of course, under Adolf Hitler, they tried to gain European hegemony. So whether it's a monarchy, a dictatorship, or a democracy, it's just sort of baked into the cake that Germany is going to be the European hegemon. The only question is how much effort, blood, and treasure do you want to spend to prevent that from happening? So I think this is completely unsurprising if you look at the broader trends of European history. We can also look and see that with the defense industries, Germany has been renowned since World War I for having the best optics in Europe. And of course, optics are more important than ever for drones and targeting systems. So we could see that whatever Euro force is created is going to have some of the best optics, which means first blood, right? If you're tankers or infantrymen or whatever, the guy that shoots first and hits first is more likely to win the engagement. And so optics is a key cutting edge there. Second of all, they have, again, the joint combat system with France, where they're going to have all these platforms linked together. So in the same way that NATO has standardized ammunition rounds and standardized weapons for spare parts, which allows for ease of logistics for infantry firearms, we're going to see probably something quite similar for ground forces and even air forces, I think, because I don't think it actually got deployed, or maybe only in small numbers. There was the Eurofighter project from the early 21st century. So they're still working on that idea. And, again, if we look at demographics, it's not that any of Germany's neighbors are better off. They're all worse off. And as far as the human capital component, which terminal philosophy you and I covered in our previous geopolitics stream, the Germans are just the best engineers in Europe, bar none. Like, if they're going to engineer something, it's going to get done, and it's going to get done the best way possible. we've seen that from World War One, when they were the first ones to deploy submachine guns and monoplanes and poison gas and everything else. And then World War II, when the Nazis had rockets and jets and guided missiles and assault rifles and night vision. Obviously too late to make a difference, but the Germans are usually first to the table, and they're usually the best. So again, and if we look at the historical track record of tactics and operations, the Germans just stomped the Russians. In World War I, they won straight up against the Russians. In World War II, they lost, but of course they were fighting on multiple fronts and couldn't concentrate their resources on the east. Nonetheless, they inflicted horrendous casualties on the Russians. So a German-led European federation against Russia today, if it actually did get to a hot war, I'm not sure Russia would do that well. At least initially it might, because the European Union any Euro army is going to be comparatively underfunded. But once it gets up to speed, I think that's going to be a decisive element in its favor. Keith Preston.
Well, I think that a key issue here is what the involves a question of what the outcome of the war in Ukraine is actually going to be. And my guess is that in the long run, it's not going to turn out very well for the Russians at all. I suspect that the war in Ukraine is probably going to be to the Russians what the war in Iraq has been to the United States, or just the war on terrorism generally has been for the United States, in the sense of being a kind of last hurrah. And that means that quite likely Russia's going to eventually withdraw from Ukraine, and that would probably leave a more hard-line nationalist, right wing or fascist or whatever you want to call it, type of regime in Ukraine. So you'll have this kind of regime of that type. In fact, I saw an article the other day where Zelensky was claiming that he wants a post-war Ukraine to be a militarized state like Israel. He was saying that Israel is his model for what he wants Ukraine to become. So it would be interesting to have a state like that right there in between the border of Russia and the European Union. And in some ways, I think that would be a buffer for both. But it seems to me that as far as the relationship between Germany and France, it's some way analogous to the relationship between China and Russia, because it seems like what the Chinese seem to make of Russia is they seem to think, well, they're basically worthless economically, except as one big oil well, but they do have an army we can use to keep the Westerners at bay in the West if we need to. And I think that's probably the overall geopolitical strategy that the Chinese have developed as far as their relationship to Russia. And I suspect Germany has a similar view of France, in the sense that they look at it like, okay, we're going to be the economically dominant power. The French may have a somewhat better military than ours, but they can be the French can basically be the military arm of a European Union or federal Europe or whatever that's economically dominated by Germany. And in parallel to that, I suspect they think that the Eastern European countries are going to be their real, their real source of fodder, I guess, if they ever go to war with Russia, if the EU ever goes to war with Russia. Because for one thing, it's those countries, it's those Eastern European countries and Slavic and Baltic countries. Those are the ones that are going to be the most hawkish when it comes to any kind of confrontation with Russia. I think the people in Scandinavia and places like that are going to be like, "What do you want to fight Russia for?" But that's not how the people in a lot of Eastern European countries feel about Russia. So it seems like that's kind of the arrangements that's shaping up. You're going to have this United States of Europe, where Germany is going to be the senior partner, due to their geography and their economic position, and France will probably be their co-CEO or VP or something like that, and kind of handle the military end of it more. But then the rank and file, military is going to probably be drawn heavily from the Central European, from the Eastern European and Baltic countries, and also from Southern Europe and the countries that are part of the former Yugoslavia and all of that. And then if they actually expand the EU into the Caucasus and some of those regions, you'll certainly see that happening there as well. That seems to be their general plan. It's the same way that in the United States, for example, where do the infantry, the actual infantry, come from? They come from like the deep South and the deep red states and that kind of stuff. Even though the ruling class is actually located in New York and D.C. and L.A. and those places, and I think that's probably going to be the relationship between Eastern Europe and Germany in the future.
Yeah, Swithun.
I think Tunnel Philosophy made an interesting point here with respect to how the Germans are basically demoralized as a people and have been basically since World War II, and said how evil and terrible they are. And that said, though, it is interesting with respect to the Russia-Ukraine war that Russia has been portrayed as this great, unique evil, which it could be mobilized in Germany to sort of get them into more of a fighting people as they were historically. So you can take their sort of pacifism and their sort of general cultural leftism to such an extent that, oh no, look, it's the Russians, they're the real Nazis, and then they can all get up and fight because they can hate themselves, but they're actually Russian, rather than hating themselves for once. So that might be a way of mobilizing the Germans to actually be a relatively decent fighting force. When it comes to trying to get a European army on the ground, again, the Russia-Ukraine situation would be a good instigator of that. I mean, prior to that, I mean, the last wars were well, I suppose you have the Serbian one, which is mainly, well, is oddly forgotten in this context. But this war is very much almost like a war against the West or the Atlantic powers, whereas the Serbian one was more of an internal, and the Bosnian stuff was very much an internal dispute, more so. So this could precipitate and create a good justification for a much more expanded. Although it depends how long it lasts. I mean, it did seem like it wasn't going to last particularly long, but it seems to be stringing out. As to whether the war in Ukraine would be Russia's Iraq, the thing that depends on Russia's goals. If they are able to take, at least to some extent, the Donbass regions area to begin with, I think they're probably going to have a much better time at holding that than America had of holding Iraq, because at least, well, depending, of course, on how favorable the ethnic Russians are. Now, of course, the Ukrainians have said, oh no, the ethnic Russians are sort of gone, how terrible the Russians are, and we're fighting beside the Ukrainians. But frankly, I trust the Ukrainians about as much as I trust Boris Johnson. So I have no confidence of whether that's actually true or not. So I do think they could possibly take and possibly hold it. They'll have difficulty holding many of the other places, but I think that's probably relatively easily held. So the question, I think, with respect to if would it be an EU army, would be how procedurally you'd be able to get it off the ground and how quickly, and when it comes to what extent other countries might put some in the pot. So in this respect, it might be easy for Germany to go alone on the military, although I think they'll assuage their consciences if they can say, oh, it's an EU army rather than the Wehrmacht. So, because at present, Germany is by far the biggest donor to the EU funds in respect to what it gets back. I mean, Britain was second, but Germany, I think, was first by quite a way. So, trying to fund it as a collective project. Well, I mean, it depends if they can say to the Germans it'd be better that way than Germany doing it. But I think you're going to have an issue of being able to how long it would take them to get that off the ground. Although, as I stated before, I think that's entirely possible. So those are my secondary thoughts on the matter.
All right, Terminal Fly.
Right, I agree with Swithun in the sense that the war in Ukraine is, serves as sort of this external impetus for Germany to sort of pull itself out of its sort of self-imposed depression and demoralization. I think regardless of whether or not there was a war in Ukraine, that Germany, I mean, this was brought up by Donald Trump, and love him, hate him, or remain neutral on Donald Trump. I think he made a good point to the Europeans in the sense that European nations should be taking more charge of their own defense, and I think that that's fine. And there's been, especially at these higher elite levels, there's been plenty of reasons to believe that America is going to be slowly retracting in terms of its global influence. And so, what that implies is that the Europeans won't be able to enjoy this umbrella of defense forever. So they're going to need to do something about that. And so he had a great point in terms of the Europeans need to take charge once again of their own defense. Keith brought up an interesting point earlier, whereas this blitzkrieg in Ukraine is sort of analogous to the war in Iraq for America. I think that's true for the most part. However, with what Swithun said in regards to holding these eastern regions of Ukraine, I think that that's probably a more realistic objective rather than these badly logistically mismanaged pincer movements on places like Kiev and Kharkiv, and so on. But we'll see how long the Russians can maintain an offensive there or war there in general before it creates real material political problems for Putin. In addition to that, once again, I would urge the people listening here to check out the leaked paper called the Strategic Perspective 2040, which again just details how Germany will react to various scenarios of the EU failing ultimately, because that is a real possibility. If you remember back to the 2015 migrant crisis due to the Syrian civil war, that basically underscored a lot of internal problems that many individual European nations had with the EU and how over-engineered and overly complicated it is, because there's these sort of these elite politicians and upper class people in Brussels creating policy for people, for rural Hungarians and Poles and things like that, and how it's just a disconnect from reality. So that in addition to the sort of this waxing and waning of various far right parties in Eastern Europe and Hungary and Poland and places like the Baltic states, that may not play so nicely with this sort of left of center political model that the EU has sort of broadly imposed on the continent. So the Germans are just basically thinking ahead in terms of defense strategy, and that's what that paper details. And then, another thing to think about is that I forget the name of the colonel that was on Fox News several times, basically just making Russia's case more or less on
Douglas McGregor.
Thank you. He was basically, giving Russia's perspective to this whole thing, and he was saying, which I believe is true, and this is obviously before the 100 billion euro defense increase, but he said basically that the only thing in between Russia and Germany is the Polish army. Now, Poland's military more broadly has been emerging in the last decade and a half or 2 decades because they've been a recipient of U.S. Foreign defense spending. They've been a recipient of various fighter jet platforms and money for training, money for weapons, money for anything defense related. So Poland is becoming a bit more robust in terms of creating a modern military. However, the results now, you have to take, I know I've mentioned war games now in several episodes, and you have to take this with a bit of grain of salt, but they're the best thing that the public has in order to gauge the performance of any modern military these days. And the results of the last several NATO and Poland war games within Poland's territory in order to take on the Russian Air Force and Army, they just did really bad. And, they did badly because of being outnumbered and basically outkitted on a tech level. So what this really suggests is that Germany really does need to, either by its own sort of, I don't know, its own moral contemplations or political contemplations, it really needs to pull itself out of this self-imposed state of depression, and it really needs to become the heart of Europe again. It already is the economic heart, but it does need to be, it does need to develop a strong military, because otherwise, Eastern Europe, in terms of geopolitical predictions, is such a difficult place to contemplate because of its flat terrain, its various ethnic overlapping problems and conflicts, and just historically, there's been so many changing of hands in terms of who's dominated Eastern Europe. It's just indefensible, and Germany is perhaps they're just the best people, the best culture, the best economy and military in order to, I believe, create the least bloody outcome for Eastern Europe with the next 50 to 100 years in mind.
Right. So as we move into closing statements, what I'll say is that if we look at Germany individually, but by extension, a federal Europe, of which minimally Germany will be the economic hegemon in, possibly even military, depending on how they want to do this, whatever problems they have are obviously less severe than what Russia has. So in the long run, they're going to be better placed to outlast Russia. And furthermore, depending on how we want to read the idea of Turkey becoming a neo-Ottoman empire, that's certainly something that George Friedman thinks is possible. I think that's possible too. I think if Turkey wants to consolidate control over the snake pit called the Middle East, they're going to be in a position not much better than Russia. Europe, even with the immigration crisis, is far more stable than Russia, far more stable than the Middle East. And, again, even if we envision all three of these regions declining due to economic and demographic pressures, I think of the three regional powers here, the federal Europe will still probably do better, right? Because as Napoleon said, it's not the guy who makes no mistakes that wins the war, but the guy that makes the fewest mistakes. Keith, final thoughts?
Yeah, your point about Turkey is interesting because that's kind of a wild card in what we've been talking about. Because there are some geopolitical analysts like Zion who think that they're a rising power, that they're going to continue to grow and expand in the future. And they're also, Turkey is an EU member as well, aren't they? Or they are NATO. I think it's NATO they're a member of. But it would be interesting to see what the relationship between Turkey and the EU would actually be. But I think Turkey's actually going to have their hands full in the Middle East because the three-way fight is brewing in the Middle East between the you have the Sunni bloc, which is led by Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, and Israel has thrown in their lots with them. And then you've got the Iranian-led bloc, and you also have a Turkish bloc. And it looks like the Qataris are actually moving towards the Turks because they've decided they hate the Saudis more. So you have this three-way fight brewing in the Middle East, and it looks like what they're going to be doing there is just fighting like they always have. So I think that would probably prevent Turkey from becoming influential, to its north or west. I think it's going to be to Turkey's south where they're going to have a lot of their issues. So if Russia is declining, that really does leave Germany holding the bag. So Germany's really, in a good position there in terms of being able to dominate the northern hemisphere in the future, at least in Eurasia. So I think that's probably where it's going to go. I mean, you're probably going to see a resurgent Germany that is essentially the leadership of the European Union and what becomes a Germanized or Europeanized NATO. And the analogy to the Holy Roman Empire earlier is fairly interesting because, you have Germany there at the heart of Europe, but then you'll have these other states that are essentially principalities that are connected through Germany, but they're not really part of Germany, even though Germany becomes the dominant hegemon. So that seems to be Europe's geopolitical future.
Final thoughts with?
I think one thing to consider here in a more general picture is the health of the West financially, particularly with respect to the levels of inflation and monetary expansion that took place in the last well, since the lockdowns, since the financial crisis 2009, especially the lockdowns of 2020. Russia, along with the Chinese, seem to be moving their currency, at least to an article by Alistair McLeod of Gold Money, moving to sort of pegging the value of their currency more towards commodities such as oil, gas, to some extent gold, which may keep their sort of overall financial system in a relatively more stable situation than that of the West. If interest rates go up in the West, the Americans and the British in particular, I'm not sure how the Germans will find with this. I find it very quite difficult to keep paying their national debt because the proportion of GDP need to pay the national debt was significantly higher when they need to roll it over. And that could severely curtail, if that's true of Germany, which I imagine it is, that could curtail their potential expansion militarily. But it depends how severe that would be. But I do recognize that, from sort of a human capital perspective, Germany are by far the best place outside of Britain in Europe.
All right, terminal philosophy, last word.
Sure. I'll just have a quick word on sort of the somewhat tall order that Germany has looking forward in terms of the next 50 years of geopolitics. I think Keith had an interesting point about the alliance between France and Germany. I think that will have to be maintained, if even for just reasons of optics. But of course, I don't foresee any real problems between France and Germany. I think that needs to be maintained, where there's basically an unwritten agreement that France sort of maintains itself as a Mediterranean and semi-Atlantic power, whereas Germany's focus is to the east. And Germany will have to maintain good relations with places like Poland, the Baltic states, Hungary, and depending on the outcome of the current conflict in Ukraine, using Ukraine basically as another influential sort of quasi-satellite state. And then it will also, kind of the more interesting psychological, spiritual, if you want to call it, thing that they have to address is simply just finding themselves again and finding their place in history and moving on from the guilt of the world wars and just finding themselves again in terms spiritually and culturally. So this all, of course, remains to be seen. But Germany has an interesting to-do list, but obviously they're most well off economically, and I think that will remain that way for at least decades to come.
All right. Thank you again, Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, Terminal Philosophy. Always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.